Welcome to the Aboriginal Channel. On this episode, we're going to learn how the term black on black crime only exists in the mythological confounds of white society. And in order to uncover the myth, we got to go into the book America, being the latest and most accurate description of the New World from 1671, written by John Ogilvy. And before I go into it, I want to just say on a side note, right now, we're looking at a small piece of confermance from my current videos where I'm saying that Aboriginal Americans built forts and castles out of stone and brick. So here in this picture from the book from 1671, you can see right back here, there's a castle looking building structure right back here. The truth is right here in the details. But over here where it's talking about the California Indians, it says their government is said to be only economical, each father ordering the affairs of his family apart without subjection to any other superior, yet so well managed that they live in good peace with one another, not without many good laws and customs, that they allow but one wife to one man, that they will punish adultery with death. Pause. So in the California Indian culture back then, they had many good laws and customs where they only allowed one woman to one man and they punished adultery with death. So if that kind of society existed within the so-called black community today, that black on black crime thing would not exist. So in order to find out or to know how the government deals with so-called black on black crime judicially, we got to go into the judicial toolkit on Indian law. An overview of key federal Indian law cases says in 1883, in examining a habeas petition where one Indian was convicted in federal court for the killing of another Indian on an Indian reservation, the Supreme Court determined that the United States treaty with the tribe did not provide for U.S. criminal jurisdiction over crimes committed by one tribal member against another. The court came to this conclusion by examining the treaty language that allowed the U.S. to deduct from the accused tribe's annuities compensation to be paid to a non-tribal member victim. Pause. So they found out that they didn't have jurisdiction over Indians' civil affairs by looking at the language of the laws in the treaty that allowed them to take money from the tribe to pay off a victim that was not an Indian, who was victimized by an Indian, pretty much. So when an Indian did something to a non-Indian, the tribe had to pay for that. But it goes on to say, such a provision did not provide jurisdiction over crimes where the injured part is of the same tribe as the accused. The U.S. intended by the treaty to secure to Indian tribes an orderly government, to create self-governing societies, and to allow the regulation by themselves of their own domestic affairs. So right here in 1883, they passed a law that says Indians have their own government and have the right to regulate their own domestic affairs. Then another interesting occurrence is right here at the end where it says the judge further justifies this decision by suggesting Indians are racial inferiors, incapable of understanding the white man's law, and that the court therefore should not force them to be subject to it. Indians didn't need the white man's law, as we read a little while ago in the book America from 1671, where Indians had their own many good laws and customs. That could be proved a little bit more by an article right here on radical.org that says the pre-Columbian Republic. So it says basically when the Iroquois Confederation was formed, no Europeans were present. It goes on to say that the Senecas, Onondagas, the Oneidas, Mohawks, and Cayugas stopped battling one another and formed a federal union. And then in 1714, the Tuscaroras, a kindred Indian nation, moved northward from what is presently the Carolinas to become the sixth national member of the Confederacy. So basically they had their own republic. Right here it says the Great Law of Peace was not written in English until 1880 when Seth Newhouse, a Mohawk, transcribed it. Pause. Notice how it got changed into English after the Civil War in 1880. But they had their own laws. Then it goes on to say, on a side note, that the tree and the principal council fire of the Confederacy were located on land of the Onondaga Nation at the center of the Confederacy, the present site of Syracuse, New York. That'll come up later in a future video. But I just wanted to point out that they had their own republic. They had their own laws. They had their own nation, their own governments. Now, notice how it said in 1880, Seth Newhouse, a Mohawk, transcribed it. But what happened to the real Mohawks? But right here on rationalskepticism.org, it says that mass graves of Mohawk children have been uncovered by ground penetrating radar at the Mohawk Institute, a residential school for Mohawk operated by the Church of England and the Vatican before its closure in 1970. According to Reverend Kevin Annett, security of the International Tribunal for Crimes of Church and States, the Mohawk Institute was set up by the Anglican Church of England in 1832 to imprison and destroy generations of Mohawk children. And I just put that in here to let you know how the Matrix was built and how there was a difference between Indians in the 1830s and Indians in the 1880s. But right here in the key federal Indian laws, we learned that they passed a law that said Indians were to self-govern themselves and regulate their own domestic affairs right there in 1883. So here what we got at abcnews.go.com, it says Indian nation destroys own buildings over leadership dispute. See how it's all wrecked right there? This was in February 22nd, so less than a month ago. It says a leadership dispute with the Cayuga Indian Nation took a stunning turn over the weekend when nation leader Clint Halftown sent bulldozers to demolish a working daycare center, store, schoolhouse, and other buildings controlled by tribe members who opposed his authority. In response to the surprise, dead of night show of power, several Cayuga families who oppose half-tons have sent their children out of town, fearing the bulldozers will come next for their homes in a dispute that is dividing families and confounding local authorities who say they are powerless to intercede in the sovereign nation's issues. The early morning raids by tribal law enforcement Saturday reduced a dozen buildings in the town of Seneca Falls to hulking piles of lumber and drywall, drawing condemnation from local and federal officials who called the action domestic terrorism. They came in here with drawn handguns, put them to the heads of the security people who were in the buildings and told them if they moved, they would be shot. And they destroyed these buildings, said Attorney Joe Heath, who represents a faction of traditional Cayuga members who split with tribal leadership about 20 years ago in a dispute over casino gambling. So you see how they've been feuding the whole time, domestic terrorism the whole time, yet they're their own sovereignty, which it says that the local authorities are powerless to intercede upon. So you see how black on black crime is a mythological description that only exists in the brains of white society. And that's how the Matrix was set up. For an example, if we go look at who the Cayuga Indians are right now, and all I did was type in Cayuga Nation and then hit the images button. And this is what came up. A bunch of Eskimos. See these? This guy looked like a Mexican, right? This guy looked like a Mexican. See, it says Cayuga Nation right here. Now, how did these Eskimos get to New York? Well, they probably came to New York by a train, but an idea of when they got there can be obtained by looking at this Wikipedia page for Hampton University, where it says Hampton University is a private historical black university in Hampton, Virginia. It was founded in 1868 by black and white leaders of the American Missionary Association after the American Civil War to provide education to the freedmen. Goes on to say that in 1878, it established a program for teaching Native Americans that lasted until 1923. Pause. So they brought these Eskimos down right around the 1870s. In 1878, they established this program for teaching Native Americans that lasted until 1923. So what do Native Americans in our times, that the Eskimos, what do they know? They know how to beat on drums, knit blankets. They know the old ancient Indian stories. They know bits and pieces of the culture and the spirituality of the Indians and things like that. And that's, in my mind, what they were being taught at Hampton University from 1878 to 1923. Now, in 1924, they passed the Racial Integrity Act. And then immediately following that, you had what was called the mass Mexican repatriation between 1926 and into the 1930s, where millions of so-called Mexicans were forced south of the border. And then that is where I believe a lot of Eskimos were put as well at that time. And then that is why we see a lot of the Eskimos at the tribes that look like Mexicans, and Mexicans down in Mexico that look like the Eskimos. That is why, right there, the mass repatriation. Then in the 1930s, what was left was basically whites and blacks. The whites were at the top of the reservations. They were already the chiefs at that time. So in the 1930s, they passed the Indian Reorganization Act, where they was giving them all this land and all this stuff. And at the same time, what they did for black folks was they did this thing called the New Deal, I think in 1939, where they give black folks food stamps. And at that same exact time, they started building projects, or what they call the ghettos. So they built the ghettos and gave us food stamps and started counting us. They wasn't able to count blacks until that time. That's why they call it the Great Migration. They say a bunch of blacks left the southern states, about a million of them, and went to the northern states for work. But I did a video on that, and about 8-9 million people showed up in the north, and only 1 million left the south. So that lets me know that that's when black folks were actually being counted, when they started building those projects, and basically between the 1930s and 1970s. One of those projects was built in LA called the Nickerson Gardens, consisted of 156 buildings with townhouse style units made up of single bedroom units. It was completed in the year 1955, and the original architect was Paul Revere Williams, which was this guy right here, an Aboriginal. Now, I pointed this out because Nickerson Gardens means to destroy the people of the garden. Through the history books, which has all been a lie. So therefore, if it's a lie, then what's the truth? If it's a lie, then what's the truth?